We were slightly disappointed last week when we checked the first round of tuning to the dungeons of Season 4 that, many of the changes were not really that impactful. So it's good to see that now, in this next round of changes in the PTR of Season 4, we have even more significant nerfs to the dungeons. Starting from the Halls of Infusion, the first really meaningful change is now the existence of a checkpoint after the Gulping Goliath. Once this guy goes down, no more runs, no more death runs, you just start from here from the get-go. It's already a pretty good time saver. Normalize the spawn rate of the crushing tsunamis down the gauntlet and slowed it down, which is also a very good quality of life change. One of the nightmares of this dungeon, in particular in Fortified, is the first part, having to deal with the containment apparatuses, or whatever, with the Containment Beam. Containment Beam has been nerfed by a lot, 42% nerf to the ability itself. However, the annoyance of the trash on this dungeon doesn't stop here, it goes deeper. This gauntlet isn't a particularly good one. Also, as well, this corridor, made even worse by the fact that now Mindsuit will still make this very hardly skippable, since these bad boys do detect stealth. The Gale Slingers in this entire run, so all of these Gale Slingers right here, are going to be losing their Thunderstorm and losing their Wind Buffet. So they basically have none of their normal current abilities. They instead get the Thunderstrike ability, which is going to inflict nature damage to all players within 7 yards of impact. So basically just dodge, as opposed to these two, which are much more dangerous and require more attention on the interrupting of this mob. A very good quality of life, even though it's not a nerf per se, is the Primalist Earth Stalker no longer having a rumbling earth clipping on the ground. Clipping is not often a massive problem. It is, though, in this slopey route where you are going down the terrain, and these guys sometimes would basically be casting an invisible rumbling earth circle that will clip under the terrain but still damage you. Now this is getting adjusted in Season 4. As far as the bosses themselves, we start with the Watcher Iridius, the first boss. His Titanic Fist, which is the tank, tank buster, basically now has a much better visual. There is also a better visual around Power Overload, the big debuff that then spawns the big puddle under your feet, but even better now, Power Field, which is what gets spawned by, the ability itself, now actually grows over time. So you have a much easier time running the hell out of this mechanic without taking unnecessary damage. Another small quality of life to make it even better as a fail-safe mechanic is adding to the Kajin the Unyielding, adding an extra particle effect, an extra warning on the ice boulders that will be able to trigger avalanche. So now detecting the broken boulders that will blow up and kill you, so you better not hide behind them, will be easier on this fight. And then the final, much better change in terms of time consumption is the last boss. The Primal Tsunami now is going to do his very beloved Submerge ability only at 50% HP, no longer tied by energy. So this means you now have, even on a 29 Tyrannical and your lovely 7-minute fight with 4 different submerges, now it's going to be a single submerge at any difficulty, every time, activated at 50% HP. Is arguably the best of the changes overall when it comes to shaving time off of this key. After Halls of Infusion, we have a few changes to Azure Vault. Remember that Azure Vault already has a pre-existing change, which is the inability to cheese the platforms anymore. You can no longer do any jumping down, any jumping around, for example, the ledge over here, to then skip the entirety of the gauntlet, right? Now you have to do this because you can no longer skip the platforms on this dungeon, so it's already a pretty big nerf to the dungeon itself. Timer has been increased by 1 minute. You have Piercing Shards now, the deadly mechanic from the Crystal Furies, having a precast visual, as well as reducing the impact of the cone of the ability. Now the cone is narrower. The Conjured Lasher's Mystic Vapors, so the, interrupt this thing if you don't want to die from the dots, will now be cast less frequently. You have the Arcane Tender's erratic growth, so basically the stun, the 6-second stun, is now cast less frequently, as well as the unstable Curator's Heavy Tome, which is the spam cast of this mob, also cast less frequently. Another good quality of life change after changing these mobs to have a much more annoying shoulder slam that ignores line of sight and does AoE damage now. Now at least the knockback of the shoulder slam has been removed, and the cast frequency also has been removed from this ability. In terms of the bosses being changed, you have only a slight one to Lamor, the first boss, where you have the erupting fissures are now going to be essentially home-seeking the players, essentially meaning the tank has to basically eat this mechanic now instead of dodging it as well. We already knew about the nerf to the tick rate of the AoE damage in the intermission of Azure Blade, from ticking every 2 seconds to ticking every 2.5 seconds. Then you have also the changes we got to Umbral Skull. You have the changes mostly around the Oppressive Miasma, which is just your very annoying movement mechanic. Well, that's gone now. Oppressive Miasma has now been removed from Mythic plus difficulty. However, of course, this must come at a cost. The cost is that now you have the home-seeking arcane balls. The crackling vortexes are now going to be chasing you for longer. They have a longer span of movement they can chase you in, as well as Crystallize, the crystal that spawns from chunking out her HP, now doing AoE damage, meaning you have to burn the thing down quickly before dying from too much damage. These are the extra changes planned for this dungeon. We did already mention most of the changes to Brackenhide Hollow. Most of these were nerfs to make many of the more annoying things less annoying, like the mega nerfs given to the first boss, for example. That is still going to be a thing. We also have gotten way more nerfs to this entire circle of aids that you have to go through before going to the second boss. You have, for example, the Brackenhide Shaper no longer summoning Lashers. You have the Brackenhide Shaper no longer spamming Touch of Decay. That's also gone. You have the Decayed Elder having a reduced cooldown on the cast time of their Decaying Roots AoE. In the first part of the dungeon, you have the Decay Speakers no longer casting the Rot Chanting Totem, which by default also removes the cast of Withering Burst, another quite annoying and frustrating mechanic in this entire dungeon for Thrash. Quite a few of the mechanics of this dungeon, especially the first boss and the first and second part of the Thrash. So all of this chunk of the dungeon has been lowered in its annoyance by quite a lot in the next season. Perhaps the more questionable ones are the changes to Algethar Academy, because the one main change is the one to the Scepters in Algethar Academy Thrash, where, yes, it's cool, you get rid of Arcane Rain, so the dodging minigame you have to play, that's gone now. They will no longer do it. As well as, in the last part of the dungeon, the Spectral Invokers having their Arcane Missiles nerfed by 50%. But that's all as far as Thrash is concerned. Even bosses, that's the more questionable part. The only reasonable nerf to the bosses is to Kroth, with its Tank Buster Savage Peck being nerfed. 13% initial damage nerf, and then 40% damage nerf to the damage of the dot itself. But besides Kroll, if anything, zero changes questionably to Vexamus, and its damage combos are gonna be quite a problem on Tyrannical, and then even a buff to Echo of the Ragosa, which was arguably the far easier of the bosses, but now it gets another ability. Gonna get Unleash Energy, which is just going to be flat AoE damage to the whole party, on top of spawning even more of the Arcane Rifts around the area. That's what's gonna be the dangerous part of this encounter now, being completely overrun by Arcane Rifts throughout the room of the last boss. We already mentioned the highlights around Neltharus. Most of them were boss changes, besides the chains themselves being nerfed. Now they are just a 5-second stun, buffing your damage by 50% for 5 seconds instead of giving you the mega AoE damage they currently do. You add the change to Chargath, where now his fiery focus, channeled, chasing ability on the tank no longer has the deadly circle around him, meaning DPS and healers can walk on top of him to break the chains. Difference now is that this mechanic will do heavy tank damage instead, so single target tank damage rather than the AoE circle around him, as well as the change to the last boss, where now the curse you get from picking up the treasure only lasts for 30 seconds but can stack. You only have to make sure to not pick up any treasures more often than 30 seconds to not make it stack, which is a good change, especially for the groups without a Curse Dispel. The other one of the questionable changes was the one to the Nokhud Offensive. You have the start of the dungeon where you have a nerf to the Nokhud Longbow, where multi-shot has now been removed, so less random damage to your casters and your healers in the group when you pull them, as well as a less frequency of the casts of Rain of Arrows. So again, less random damage to your group. We already mentioned how the hunt prey of the Beastmaster to send its pet into a frenzy has been reduced in damage. But those were most of the changes, basically, with a slight change to the last boss in the intermission, the storm winds. So the circles on the ground you have to dodge randomly in the fight now happen every 10 seconds instead of 6. An easier time dodging the lightning paddles from the ground on this last boss, but that's it though. Nothing else for Nokhud Offensive. The last of the significant changes goes to Ruby Life Pulse. We already mentioned a few of the changes. Another one of the reasonable ones is the nerf to the Terra Sentries. Now, their stun missile is basically being removed. So now they just whack you in the head and do nothing else. You don't have to worry about the stun missile cast anymore, which is quite good. Keep track of, especially if you want to do the Giga Pull at the start, taking all of this, you have to deal with 5 of them. Now, not really, because these are mostly harmless. Last change, though, is to the last boss. We already mentioned the changes to the Inferno Core, which now lasts for 4 seconds. It's already changed right now in the tooltip, instead of 3 seconds. Extra change now is that on top of this, now the dot damage has also been nerfed. Now it has been nerfed by 25%. Damage to make it even more manageable. Yes, wondering, question marks, to the changes of the second boss and even the changes of the first boss. They are currently still kept untouched. But these have been all of the changes we have had available so far in this next round of tuning in the PTR. Now, the question is, of course, what about the seasonal affix? Isn't this a fated season? Isn't the entire point of a fated season to have the extra experimental affix like we got in Shadowlands for both the raid and mythic class? That is perhaps the most questionable of the missing features of the season. If there is one thing to make the season more entertaining, get players to come back and try something else, especially if you're bringing back old dungeons of the expansion, especially if many of these dungeons were not particularly enjoyed by the player base. One of the things that could help players being interested again would have been, of course, the addition of a fated affix, which for the moment is missing, including, by the way, the one from the raid. At the moment, we don't have an affix in either game modes for PvE. That is perhaps the more disappointing change, which is why even when reading most of these dungeon changes, which are more or less all nerfs to improve the quality of life inside those dungeons for you, the player, it is still sort of bittersweet, because you know, at the very least for now, these changes will be coming without anything new, anything extra, no special affix or anything of the sort. That's the current set of changes for today on this Wednesday. TLDR is positive changes, good quality of life additions, but it will still all be better if we actually had a seasonal affix available. With this out of the way, we are now taking a break and leaving each other on the middle of this week. Thanks, of course, as usual, to everyone who is supporting, whether through Patreon or completely for free, like liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. And then, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, no, but for real, they really need to put a seasonal affix in Mythic Class if they want players to get into it again.